Just imagine it's 2025 and Amazon HQ2 is now a reality. Employees come at work by flying electrical drone, landing on top of a skyscraper where a concierge awaits them to start their 4-hour working day with lunch break included. Amazon is hiring like crazy and Jeff Bezos himself is desperately looking for candidates just like you. So as Jeff Bezos himself once said, he'd rather interview 50 people and hire none of them as to making a bad hire. And to his credit, Amazon is a hugely successful business, so this should be the correct mindset after all. Now, frankly speaking, there are a few people that are really good at what they're doing, but most likely they already have a job, so for the rest of us we have to go the more traditional interviewing way. And as with any interviewing process, the idea is to differentiate yourself from the others. And notice here I said differentiate, not compete against other candidates, because the idea is to create some sort of competitive advantage. And the best way to do it is to get a strong referral. And in fact, it's also the Amazon recruiters themselves encouraging this as being a very strong differentiator. Because let's think about it. If you have to refer one of your friends to your own company, would you risk your company's time and reputation to hire somebody average or not fit for that job? I doubt you would, and this is why having a strong referral is the best way to skip the line. How do you get someone to refer you? So if you're asking yourself this question, you probably don't know anyone at Amazon, in which case I would encourage you to double check your social media connections. For example, if you go on LinkedIn and just type Amazon, it will automatically show you the closest connections that work at Amazon, and the probability is probably higher than you think, because Amazon recently increased by their workforce to more than 500,000 employees, and this includes the 90,000 Whole Foods employees that they acquired last year. So who knows, the time investment is small and the benefits are well worth your time here. Another method here to improve your chances to pass some filters is to find out who is your hiring manager and just cold call them. I know it sounds uncomfortable, and it really is uncomfortable, but you should be aware that the most successful people that got into the best paying jobs nowadays all had to do something special at some point during their hiring process. So for instance, Google's top recruiter Laszlo Bock simply cold called 4 of Google's HR hiring managers, and one of them eventually got him hired. So even if you just walk into an Amazon shop and inquire more about your position, your chances can only increase in this scenario. And just remember one thing here: as long as you act in a civilized way and you're not breaking any laws, all these actions are always pretty much to your advantage. This is how long a recruiter spends on your CV. And if you ask me, it might be even less than that to form an impression about you. Because you know, they have tons of software nowadays that are already looking, or I should say parsing your CV, so they will most likely already have an impression even before opening your CV. So would you recruit yourself based on the first 6 seconds of watching your CV? Here's what you can do here. First, make sure that you have the most relevant information on top. For example, if you had 10 jobs in the past, make sure you post the most relevant one in the top, followed by the second most relevant one, and so on. Now, a quick warning here: if you omit mentioning a job in your resume, make sure you note somewhere in bold even that you were employed during this period. I'm saying this because there are some recruiters that simply detest employment gaps, so you should make sure that you are very clear and very specific about these things. Second point here: be clear about what you've done in your job and use metrics if possible. For example, you increase sales by 50% while decreasing fixed costs for a period of 2 years. Keep only the relevant information and make it sound smart. Also, avoid name dropping from position titles. Be as explicit as possible what that position title is supposed to mean. The idea is to help the recruiter understand as much as possible about you. Next, you should know that Amazon banned PowerPoint-style presentations from all their meetings because they very much favor storytelling. So your time is well invested into properly wording your resume. And finally, as a last piece of advice here, triple check your spell checking. Because I know a ton of recruiters that like to reject candidates because of just one small spelling mistake. So one method to triple check this would be to simply ask a friend to help you with this, or otherwise you could just Google the most interesting sentences under apostrophes and see what the results are. Remember here, recruiters love filters and spell checking is one of their favorite. Alright, so you made sure that you know your thing, you're well qualified for the job, and now it's time to check out the other 50% of the Amazon interview, because in case you don't know, that's how much emphasis Amazon puts on hiring for cultural fit. And actually I was quite surprised about this one myself when my video about their 14 leadership principles went viral. Now, how do you go about these 14 leadership principles? So at first you should read them, and feel free to pause here if you'd like to do it right now. Then you should know that for each of these there are anecdotes that Jeff Bezos talks about whenever he has a chance. Now, one hack here would be to also take a look at my 2-minute video explaining some of these anecdotes from their leadership principles. Or if you prefer to spend more time watching Jeff Bezos, I also have the video that went viral from my leadership series. It's around 20 minutes long. And if you can't get enough of Jeff Bezos, I also have a third video that's around 24 minutes long, which, by the way, I also linked in the video description right next to that like button. Now, what is important here? And there are two parts. The first part is to associate those principles to some personal, genuine stories that would emphasize you as a great cultural fit into Amazon's culture. And I know it sounds like a time-consuming task, and indeed that may well be the case, but I believe it's time well spent as compared to watching Jeff Bezos for an hour and just ending up entertained as after a Netflix movie. So the proposed approach, my proposed approach here would be to invite you to watch the 2-minute video and write down your stories about the groups of principles that I determined in that content, and also eventually memorize them if you can. Okay, and maybe one note here, just try to use some keywords from the leadership principles when writing your own stories. Alright, now with respect to the second part of these leadership principles, it's the way that you should prepare yourself to answer questions related to them. For example, the easiest scenario is that Amazon will ask you to simply develop on a story on one of the principles, for example, the customer centricity. But what usually happens here is they will ask you a question that it's not directly related with the principles, and I'll give you an example in a moment. So the idea is to answer these questions as a story using the STAR method, and this is a method that Amazon advertises themselves, which basically means that every time you're answering a question, to think of a situation, of a task, of an action as a result. So I know there's a learning curve here, and I encourage you to take a look at some examples of both questions and answers of such scenarios, so feel free to pause the video here if you like. And finally, why it's important to both learn your own stories and how to answer them. Because you see, whenever you're being asked a question, you would have to first associate that question to a personal story that you have, and then prepare to answer it using the STAR method. Now, if you wouldn't have your own story at first, you would have to first make something up on the moment, and then think about answering it using the STAR method. So even if you end up memorizing the 14 leadership principles, which I don't recommend by the way, keep in mind that it's your ability to link the recruiter's question to your own personal story, to identify yourself with their culture, what's really matters here. And your story will be much better received if you manage to insert some keywords from the leadership principles, such as customer centricity or dive deep or ownership.
Yes, I swear it's a truth.
I believe that many of you have already seen this movie, and it certainly looks like the perfect example of how recruiters see interviews. Now, what's interesting here is what it took to reach that level of perfection. Now, you see, many people's worst fear of interviewing is that they'll become anxious, so it's pretty much like going on your first date. Now, how do you fix that? How do you resolve that? And the simple answer is to prepare as much as possible. Now, how do you prepare for such an event? And there are several ideas here. For instance, you could ask your friends to interview you, or you could, I don't know, maybe start making some YouTube videos, even live videos if you want to get over this much faster. Ideally, the point here is to reach a mindset that allows you to take leadership over the situation. Now, this one should be self-explanatory, but believe it or not, it's often that recruiters verify a candidate for job fit by not their answer to the questions, but by the questions that they ask themselves. So, needless to say here, you have to prepare some questions for the Amazon interview, and here are some examples, so feel free to pause if you like. And finally, just a final note here, remember that it's generally okay to talk about pay during the interview. Okay, so you sweat all the technical details, you nailed the leadership principles, and everybody interviewing you is happy. So your interview cannot go wrong, right? Then suddenly and out of nowhere, there's some weird guy that doesn't even seem related with your team, but he's certainly an Amazonian, and it's certainly not Jeff Bezos, but he is asking you impossible questions. That guy is the bar raiser. He makes a living on the recruiting process, and his main job is to ask you some special questions in order to test you as a fit inside Amazon. Now, how do you react? And I believe the most important part here is to understand that Amazon is not usually looking for perfection. In fact, they are well used with various failures. Your best bet here is to make sure that you understand her question. And if you don't, make sure you ask subsequent questions until you do so. And as a general advice here, if you have a good imagination, that is, if you are good at systems thinking, it will very much help you to build an answer here. Properly nailing the leadership principles is a must, because you see, the bar raiser is there to check if you can increase the value of the team that you're applying to. And yes, they have veto power over your application. They are mainly there for corporate positions, so they are most likely not going to be involved in any warehouse job opportunities, for example. So while there's many speculation going on as to what is their real role, I would recommend you to make sure that you properly understand the question in the first place, because this is the most important part of this whole situation. Now, to be fair here, this is kind of a clickbait title, because in all fairness, even if you make some of these mistakes but you create a great impression, you will likely get the job. However, the main reason why I'm introducing this is because Amazon recruiters have been quite vocal about these next points. And the first common mistake here is something that I earlier discussed about in a previous section, that is name dropping on your position title and a brief job description on your resume. So Let me give an example here. For instance, instead of just saying I helped grow revenue, just say something more specific with metrics. For instance, I helped grow sales by 500% in 12 months by doing this. And the next common mistake here is to not act as yourself, to not be natural. And I'm sure that many of you might say here, okay, but I'm very good at behaving like this, to which I'd answer you, okay, but you should know that recruiters do this pretty much every day. So if you're engaging into such a behavior, you should know that they are a lot better than you assume they are at spotting these things. And if they do spot such a behavior, then it's most likely game over. And finally here, if you're thinking about lying about your education on your CV, which is pretty common nowadays, around 50% of applicants do so according to some statistics, just keep in mind that your resume is likely to stay with the company for a long time. Also, if you're attending an on-site interview, you should dress for success, because many Amazon recruiters noted this as to be one of their favorite filters. And one trick here would be to keep an outfit, an interviewing outfit that you may use whenever you attend one. Now, before I begin answering this, keep in mind that the usual answer for any respectable employer is that as many as needed. Now, this being said, there's tons of information on the internet as to what are the main steps, and often by the position title that you're looking for. But generally speaking, it all begins with an account on Amazon.jobs, followed by a phone interview and some on-site interview. Now, let me split this into three categories. A senior web developer can expect an initial contact with a recruiter, followed by a phone interview, which will most likely be followed by a more technical second phone interview. Now, if successful, that will lead to the on-site experience, which will be comprised of 4 to 6 interviews, which if successful would lead to a formal offering. Also, there's a great blog post that I linked in the video description right next to that like button that details this process and what to expect during it. For a fulfillment center associate, you will apply online, then either you'll follow up with a phone interview or you will be asked directly on site. On site, there may or may not be a formal interviews, and you may also be directly offered with a contingent workforce contract, and there will be a drug screening test that will likely take a few days to complete, and then it's the hire orientation, and that's it. For a customer service associate, it all starts with the Amazon.jobs account. Then it wildly varies according to your location. You may be asked to fill in an assessment, you may be offered some video link, or it might be something else. The idea is that it mainly varies upon both the location as well as how fast they are looking to fill this role. And last but not least, be sure to investigate about the team you're interviewing for. It's very common that people leave reviews with specific information, both how the working environment is there, as well as with the hiring process. And also, don't believe people if they tell you that it takes an eternity to get a job at Amazon, because this wildly varies upon their needs at that specific moment. Now, this one will sound weird for many people, but particularly for the ones seeking technical roles. However, it's not by mistake that listening skills were the most in demand for the past few years. And yes, you've heard that right. You don't necessarily have to be a genius to be in a very good paying job, so long as you have these listening skills. So what makes a great listener? And a great listener is someone that puts a lot more emphasis on the other side as opposed to thinking of what they're going to say next. And to give an example here, if you're during an interview with a recruiter and that recruiter starts a monologue, a longer one, you should encourage them with an to show that you do care about their job. So, when do you think you have the most chances to pass over to the next interviewing stage? When you talk more or when you talk less than a recruiter? Now, why would this be? Well, it turns out that we have a natural inclination to talk, and if we invest our time to listen as opposed to speak to the other party, we both allow the recruiter to make his job better, as well as to allow them to feel better, actually. And just as a side note here, when do you think you have the most chances now to screw up things? When you talk more or when you talk less? I mean, why would these companies invest so much time and so many steps into the recruiting process just to get one hire? And this pretty much applies to everything we do in our lives. The better we listen, the more successful we become. So in a previous section I told you to think of interviewing like dating. The more you do, the better you become, and I believe the correlation still stands here. So next I'm going to present you with the most common reasons that applicants regret spending their time on while considering to apply for a job at Amazon. Number one and most common one by far is not spending enough time for the technical part. Know your thing. That's the most important advice that anyone can give you about the Amazon interview. And the simplest example here is to look at the programmer's preparation. You see, there are not that many problems that you should solve. You just have to spend the time to go through the theory and explore the examples. And I'm not at all suggesting that you should try to memorize all the possible problems with their answer, because there are simply too many of them. It would just take you years to do this. And the second common mistake that I've heard many candidates for well-paid positions to do is to just simply fall in love with the Amazon principles and end up spending hours watching Jeff Bezos talking about them. I mean, so to be clear here, Jeff Bezos is a great speaker and storyteller, and he is the richest person in the world. However, I don't believe that that's the best employment of your time to this whole situation. And this is actually one of the main reasons that I've done my 2-minute video into which I explain those 14 leadership principles. And finally, you prepare, you do your stuff and place your bid without waiting for 1 year for this. Because you see, it's not excluded that the Amazon recruiter will call you back in 2 months asking you to reconsider that offering. The essential part of this is to look at it as a part of a journey instead of a destination.